So from the IRA, we go to the termination era. And the periods aren't so neat and, they're not so easily divided. You could say that the Indian Reorganization Act, or the IRA era, or the Indian New Deal, as they call it, kind of extended into the 40s. But after World War II, things began to change a lot. And the first real part of the Indian, let's put it this way, in most history classes or anthropology classes, where you will learn about the various periods or eras of United States Indian policy, okay? At least I'm speaking from my experience. We always started the Indian Reorganization Act, we always started the termination era, and sometimes called it the termination relocation era. We usually started that in 1953. Okay, 1953 was an important year because what was going on in 1953? Korean War was coming to a stalemate. What else?
Cold War.
The Cold War was going full speed.
So the nuclear testing?
Yeah, nuclear testing. Associated with the Cold War, there was the Second Red Scare, right? McCarthyism. That's when Joseph McCarthy was pointing out, people and calling them communists. And all you had to do was be associated with a communist to be, considered a subversive or a potential enemy of the state. Yeah. So it was a time that, until Joseph McCarthy was shut down, it was a very scary time. And 1953 was also the year that a very important piece of legislation was passed that we'll talk about. But I like to say that the termination era really kind of emerged with 1946. So right after World War II, there was something known as the Indian Claims Commission Act. Okay? So let me jump to it if I can. We'll come back to this. Okay, the Indian Claims Commission, 1946, was a tribunal, sort of. It was a lot like like a federal court. And to this point, there had been tribes suing the Department of the Interior or whomever agency of the government because of historical claims that they had. For example, under a treaty of cession, of a land cession, maybe done in the 19th century, the tribe was supposed to be receiving a certain amount of money for the land and maybe a certain amount of annuities, and the government, especially after allotment, that just began to disappear as tribal governments were taken down. And so these new tribal governments established under the Collier years began to sort of, hey, by the way, federal government, you never compensated us for a couple of million acres of land that you took. So they went to federal court. Now, in the way the federal court system is established, you have 12 circuit courts of appeal, right? You have the federal district courts, then you have the circuit courts of appeal, and there are 12 of those based on geography of the United States, wherever your state is. But there's a 13th court, and that's the United States Court of Claims. The United States Court of Claims is for people suing the federal government or having an interest against the federal, or a claim against the federal government. And so the tribe started going to the United States Court of Claims, and it got so bogged down. The Court of Claims had so many cases coming in, and they said, hey, we need to make a sort of a special court for Native American tribes who have these claims against us. So they created this. The Congress created the Indian Claims Commission. So it wasn't in the judiciary so much. It was to relieve the Court of Claims, but again, it was run by Congress, not the judicial branch. Okay. So anyway, it was a special court to hear the claims and settle all claims. Started in 1946, intended to only run a few years. And what happened there was the tribes were allowed to sue the federal government for land claims. And we'll talk more about this next time. But once the tribe accepted a claim under the Indian Claims Commission, it was all settled according to the federal government. They couldn't come back. So you couldn't put the federal government in double jeopardy, basically. All right. We'll come back to that next time. And thank you for. Oh, it's 10:05. Is that right? So I'm rushing through this for nothing? Okay. I'm going to hold you then. Okay. Holding you to it. So let's look at the termination era a little bit more. But just keep in mind that the Indian Claims Commission, my phone can't be wrong, is it? Oh, I was looking at the wrong thing. Okay. It started at 9:07. I was thinking it was 10:07 or something. Okay. So anyway, the termination era, you might say it started, I don't know why I put 1940, but, because Collier's ideas met with trouble after so many years. By 1940, Congress was having hearings on it. Okay, so Collier winds up getting hammered, but this set of hearings, Congress started sort of dismantling what Collier had put together in 1940 with this Committee on Indian Affairs. Okay, so the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs established in 1940, and the BIA was criticized for its heavy-handedness with the Constitution effort. So we can say that Collier's revolution lasted until about 1940, and then World War II changed everything, of course. There were laws passed between 1940 and 1952 that granted legal jurisdiction to certain states with reservations. This is sort of the pre-PL 280 thing. So during World War II and just as the Cold War is taking off, reservations in Iowa, Kansas, and New York came under the judicial authority of the states. All right, and so this was formalized in law in 1953. But we've talked about the Merriam Report, right? There's also something called the Hoover Commission Report. I don't think this is mentioned in your reading, but it was the formal name was the Commission on Organization of the Executive Branch of Government, Indian Affairs, a report to Congress. So in 1949, the Senate went after the executive branch and its in Collier's programs, began to basically say that they've created all of these governments. Not necessarily every American Indian person wants to be under these tribal governments, okay? Because they're all United States citizens now. And this led eventually to the 1953 House Concurrent Resolution 108. So H.R. 108 was sort of the precursor to this law, but basically it began to allow certain tribes to basically dismember themselves. All right. So 109 bands and tribes were terminated at that point, and that composed, less than 12,000 total people in 109 bands and tribes. So these were the really small ones. This was about 3% of all reservation land, 1.3 million acres, about the size of a Payne County altogether, were dismantled. So not a lot, but apparently this seemed like a really good idea. So later on, Public Law 83-280, often referred to as just PL 280, was passed, and this transferred criminal jurisdiction from the federal government to state jurisdiction in certain states. There were what we called mandatory PL 280 states, and they were initially these 5: California, Minnesota, Nebraska, Oregon, and Wisconsin. And later on, when Alaska would enter the Union, it would also come under this designation. So the states that were mandatory states just received all authority over criminal and civil, civil suits against Indians. So criminal jurisdiction was passed from the federal government under the Major Crimes Act, right, to the states under PL 280. And then state courts also got authority over, that's supposed to be suits, looks like something else, civil suits against Indians. So basically, these states were handed authority over Indian reservations, Indian tribal governments, Native American people, both in criminal and civil affairs. Did those states necessarily want it? Not necessarily. All right? And there were other optional PL 280 states that could participate later, but these were the first 5, and then Alaska was 6th, 5 years later. We're talking about Hawaii here. So the federal government transferred trust responsibility to the state of Hawaii with this. So Hawaii was also kind of included for Native Hawaiians. We'll talk a lot about this, and this is still around. So there are PL 280 states still today, and this has it's always something to consider when dealing with Indian policy. In fact, if it weren't for the PL 280 states, Indian affairs in places like Oklahoma, the non-PL 280 states, would be quite different than today. So we'll talk about that next time. We'll come back to this ugly slide, but relocation was just a different thing. It wasn't very successful at all. But PL 280 is still with us, and we'll come back to that next time. So now it's time to go. We're close enough. So anyway, y'all have a great day. Termination is one of those subjects that, after looking at the Indian Reorganization Act and the John Collier's sort of revival of tribal governments, even though John Collier was sometimes, not trusted, particularly by Indian tribes. I don't know how you do this. It's in the way, but anyway, even though John Collier wasn't always necessarily trusted by the Indian tribes or by Republicans, or even for that matter, some of the New Dealers, he nevertheless changed things forever in Indian country by helping tribes revive their political functioning and making that political functioning very legitimate. So it was a very, very good time for the cause of Native American tribal sovereignty. Then you have World War II come along, and John Collier winds up sort of evaporating into the history books. And after World War II, the United States was less concerned with internal affairs and far more concerned with international affairs, with the Cold War starting up. Beginning with some events in Turkey, and then in the Berlin airlift, and then, of course, in Korea, when China, in the early days of communist China and Russia were allies, but probably lucky for us, they wound up getting into their own disputes and and not really being so much allies. But anyway, we get into the Cold War, and so the United States kind of is concerned less about internal politics. So let me go ahead and get started then. And this is the PowerPoint on termination. And we had gotten through some of this the other day on Tuesday. Termination is the period that your textbook utilizes. And I've mentioned that it's sometimes referred to as the relocation period as well. There's a very good history of this called Termination and Relocation. Forget the author, but it was done, I think, back in the 80s. And anyway, the relocation program deserves a little bit of mention. It was an attempt by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, by the executive branch, to integrate mostly Native men who were on rural reservations, especially very isolated reservations in the Mountain West. And this was kind of like this is similar to the Great Society programs that attempted to allow. We were talking about termination, and so and relocation. So relocation was similar to some of these new Great Society programs under the Lyndon Johnson administration. Basically, it was jobs, sort of like a Job Corps program specifically for Native Americans, and it attempted to establish employment opportunities in large cities, particularly manufacturing jobs, assembly line jobs. Didn't require a lot of educational preparation necessarily, and with the idea of allowing Native American men and their families to relocate to American metropolitan areas. And oftentimes the government, lined up the whole interview thing and found the job. Of course, this is during what we call a post-war boom, so the economy is just barreling away, and there are a lot of jobs, particularly in places like Detroit, and in the aerospace industry and on the West Coast cities. So it would find, like an apartment or some kind of housing. It would, get everything lined up, do all the hard work for you. If you ever relocate to some place for a job, it's a lot of work at first, right? Anyway, so they did all this, and then people were invited to take advantage of this, and so they would move from maybe the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming or something to Los Angeles. What a change! And so they would typically work there. And some of them wound up staying, and so this is this is the basis for a lot of the populations of Native Americans in large cities and in inner cities today. They refer to them as urban Indians now. So, but I think the majority of people who went through this program kind of took it as okay, this is nice, and they did it for a little while, and then they returned to the reservation and returned home. Maybe they didn't like the big city. Maybe they just were enjoying the program a little bit, but didn't necessarily intend to stay. So, that's about all that deserves, I think. There is a book on this topic by one of our professors here in the history department, Dr. Doug Miller, who did his PhD down at the University of Oklahoma. And so he's kind of the expert on this. We should have him come in and talk about it sometime. Termination, however, is the big one for this era. And again, it's related to the effects, sort of social effects of World War II. All right. started listening to podcasts, all right? This is interesting for me. I know podcasts have been around forever, right? Probably your entire lifetime. But I just started listening to this series of history podcasts, and one that I've been listening to lately was on the civil rights movement. And this podcast, if you want to know about it, I'll tell you about it after class. One of the episodes in this podcast really did a fantastic explanation of the roots of the civil rights movement, African American civil rights movement, before World War II, and immediately after World War II, and the fact that the United States military integrated during the Second World War, and African American people went to fight in the war. Native Americans have been fighting in the United States wars forever, basically on the United States side. Somebody was, especially World War I, World War II, in Korea and Vietnam. But the podcast did a really good job about explaining this social change that, when veterans came back, African American veterans came back, they were discriminated against in the workplace, or discriminated against, of course, in the Jim Crow South, including Oklahoma. Oklahoma was very much a Jim Crow state. But the civil rights movement really got its fire, really got its energy from those veterans, both men and women, who had served their country, and then they got the question of, okay, well, what did we put our lives on the line for? To come back and be treated like very much second-class citizens. So they didn't put up with that. That's when we began to see the sit-ins and here in Oklahoma City, the lunch counter protests. And Oklahoma integrated pretty painlessly compared to most other states. Arkansas had a real bad time with it. But anyway, that movement was one in which, and by the way, here's a good place to think about this. I may have said it before, but American Indians, tribal members, were often during the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s sort of taken. A lot of African American civil rights leaders attempted to take American Indian leaders under their wing and show them how to do the civil rights thing. And that was very brief. And American Indians, at least the ones that had some maybe legal training, eventually said, "No thanks. We don't need you. We don't need your approach." Why did they do that? Why did they do that?
Because it looked bad to the government, and they wanted to, work with the government and get benefits from the government.
Well, number one, African Americans have been working forever, since the Civil War, since emancipation, to be included within the United States society, to be accepted, all right? To be accepted for who they are, and to be integrated into the society. Integration is a very important word in black civil rights. American Indians, on the other hand, don't want that, and they have been fighting that forever. Integration is not what they want. They want recognition. Recognition of sovereignty. And some of the, African American civil rights leaders sort of, got a kind of a cold reckoning, a cold welcome when they were attempting to do that. But in other words, the United States has been trying like crazy to integrate Native Americans into American society, at the same time keeping African Americans out. Okay? So we've got, the two different approaches here. And after World War II, after World War II, the federal government has one more way and to begin to integrate Native Americans. And that is by looking at reservations created during the New Deal under Collier's watch, and seeing so many of these, so many of these tribes, I shouldn't say reservations, that's a big one. I should say tribes. Recognition of tribes and their sovereignty in mostly up in the Midwest, in the upper Midwest, and in California, where you would have a very small number of tribal members, but yet they were sovereign and they were clear to act as sovereign entities. And when you have 150 people, so the government's saying, why would the federal government want to work with a so-called sovereign of 150 people? It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense for the federal government fiscally it doesn't make any fiscal sense from the point of view of the federal government to provide federal administrative oversight for a tribe of 400 or 500. The cost is outrageous compared to what they're getting from it. So anyway, the Indian Claims, I mentioned the Indian Claims Commission last time. Well, my discussion was leading into the most significant legislation of the time, and that was House Concurrent Resolution 108, 1953. And this was basically the Termination Act. Okay, it wasn't really a law; it was a resolution. But basically, it set up the framework for terminating tribes. And we have to remember that termination is is focused on the relationship between an American Indian tribe and the federal government. It sounds like the federal government, and when I was studying this as a student, I always assume, okay, well, the federal government's basically saying you guys don't exist anymore as a tribe. But that's not right. That's not what termination meant. Termination was the ending of the relationship, the government-to-government relationship between the federal government and the tribe. The tribe can continue to have its own government. It just wouldn't be recognized by the federal government. Therefore, the tribe's status goes from a federally recognized tribe to a non- or unrecognized tribe, which there are many in the country. And even in Oklahoma, there's a couple dozen or more, maybe 3 dozen. So don't confuse termination with, the Terminator, who shows up and says, Sarah Connor, but and eliminates the tribe. The tribe's still there. Not only is the tribe still there, the tribe still has treaty rights. Okay? So terminated tribes still exist, and they still are, the government still has obligations to them and treaty rights. They're just not recognized as federally recognized tribes, and therefore don't share in the same federal programs, basically, of the federally recognized tribes. Okay? Now, the termination era has that's a black mark on the United States Indian policy, because the tribes were terminated. 109 bands and tribes lost their federal recognition. That's probably a better way to say it. They lost their federal recognition, and the total of all of those 109 entities was not even 12,000 people. Not that I'm not trying to justify that, but essentially these were groups that were so small they wouldn't organize themselves. They wouldn't really recognize themselves as a political entity anyway. So the federal government, under Eisenhower, basically began slashing. Eisenhower is elected in 52, takes office 53. So Eisenhower administration and Congress is the one that actually makes the changes, eliminates those tribes over a number of years into the 50s and the 60s. Anyway, another more significant piece of legislation during this period was Public Law 83-280, popularly known as simply PL 280. Okay, I talked a little bit about this. California, Minnesota, Nebraska, Oregon, Wisconsin were the original 5 mandatory PL 280 states. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't ask for criminal jurisdiction over Indian land, but they got it. And Alaska came in to the Union in the late 50s. Was Hawaii the last? 59? Okay. So 1958 is when Alaska became a state. It had been a territory for a long, long time. So Alaska comes in, and it's also a PL 280 state, and Alaska's a real different critter. We'll talk about Alaska's different in a different time. But there were also PL 280 could also allowed other states, if they so chose, to take over certain facets or all of jurisdiction, criminal jurisdiction and civil jurisdiction within the reservations within their boundaries. Okay. Now, there were some states that did that, but a lot of states soon realized that all this did was establish an unfunded mandate. That is, it required the states to basically provide police service and other state services to people who didn't pay taxes to the state. And so it was a loss. And basically the federal government didn't provide any assistance to the states. They just handed it to them. And so the states were sitting, okay, this is a loss for the states. Not only is it a loss, but it's a bad situation, because if you're going to enforce laws in Indian country, you're immediately going to be met with ambivalence, at least, by the people you're trying to work with. So after not too long, the states wound up realizing this is a real bad situation. That neither do the Indian people want us enforcing the law. They don't want to go to state courts. And we don't want to have to provide this service at our own expense. So why should we have to do that? It's federal land. It's trust land, right? So some states eventually were removed from PL 280. But most of the PL 280 states, including some of the optional PL 280 states, remain as such. Now, last time I kind of alluded to the idea that if it weren't for PL 280, things might not have been so fortunate for Native Americans later on in history, and I'll have to explain that when we get to Indian gaming. But more recently, as in the last few days, I've been looking at this whole McGirt decision. I have found more legal articles in legal journals, law journals, than I have newspaper articles about the whole thing in the Daily Oklahoman. We call it the Oklahoman now. Unbelievable. Okay? In other words, the legal scholars are going berserk over this. But I'm just thinking about, okay, the whole argument that Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma, had against the Creek Nation, which was, it wasn't trying to defend Jim C. McGirt, a child molester, okay? It wasn't trying to defend him, but it was defending its interest in the case. So basically, it's, even though it's McGirt versus Oklahoma, it's really it's really Creek Nation versus Oklahoma in a lot of ways. And the argument that the state of Oklahoma brought to keep the status quo and not allow the Creek Nation and therefore the rest of the 4 civilized tribes to be declared a reservation. Maine, they had several arguments, none of them of which worked. But their arguments were, number one, these were never reservations in the first place. And I've said that in class, and I kind of stick with that. They really weren't in the sense that reservations as they were created were. Nevertheless, later on, Congress referred to them as reservations, probably ignorantly, but yet they call them reservations, and that helped the Creek Nation's case. Number two, they argued that the changing of title of all of the land within the Creek Nation basically terminated or basically disestablished the reservation as if they're reservations. I've mentioned this in class a little bit because what's interesting to me is that the courts used a judicial test that was developed in the 1980s to test an event that took place in around 1900. So it's kind of like upstreaming the whole process. Number three, and there may have been a few others, but the other main argument was that the state of Oklahoma had was the argument of massive disruption. Okay, massive disruption. And you know what case the state of Oklahoma used to base this idea that mass disruption was an excuse for the tribes not to, or for the tribes' jurisdiction not to be declared reservations? You know what that was? What case? Massive disruption. It was Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock. Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
That's what Congress did. Congress said, they said, sorry, we screwed up. They didn't say, I don't think they apologized, but they basically recognized the fact that Congress had screwed up. But then they said, well, Congress has the right to screw up and the right to not do anything about it because Congress has plenary power over Indian tribes. All right. Well, if that and that was basically ignored by the courts. That's really very much a political thing. So the courts, and I think that's probably where most of the justices parted ways on that issue. I think the conservative members of the court, those appointed by Republicans, the conservative members sided with that argument of disruption, which is, going to really, it has the potential to really change things in the business community of eastern Oklahoma, in Tulsa particularly. And, there are mineral issues to be worked out. They had a lot of lobbyists. I think the liberal side of the court was very much ignoring that because of the principle involved. They didn't want to be on the wrong side of history, I think. But what I was trying to get at is, in that case, basically the state of Oklahoma was making the argument that they were the original they didn't say this, okay? They didn't say this. But they were making the same argument that they were kind of the original PL 280 state because we came in as a state and the interpretation of the Oklahoma Enabling Act was that the state received jurisdiction over all federal cases pending. So basically it was throwing all of the Native American cases to the jurisdiction of the state of Oklahoma. Do you remember reading about all that in your Oklahoma history class? I mean, that was one of the things that always kind of threw me. It's like, how can they do that? They can't do that. That makes Oklahoma very, very exceptional to the rest of the states. And that's what the 5 members who voted for Creek Nation on the Supreme Court basically said, is that Oklahoma is not exceptional. So I guess we're still just okay. All right. So anyway, they were kind of saying we already had all this originally, and Supreme Court says no. So, all right. State of Hawaii comes in here too. We'll treat Hawaii separately, and the rest of this is about relocation, which we've already talked about. I think I wound up with this slide. It's basically maybe a slightly neater representation of what I've said. So 58, Alaska, 53 here. By the way, the PL 280 applied really reservation by reservation, okay? So in the case of Minnesota, all the reservations except the Red Lake Reservation. In the case of Oregon, all the reservations except the Warm Springs Reservation. Why was that? Because this was all about state and civil criminal jurisdiction to Indian country, because there was no good sovereign operating in those reservations, okay? But the exceptions are Red Lake and Warm Springs. They had operating courts. They had, I guess they probably had operating police forces of some sort. So the federal government said, except for those reservations, they will stay federally recognized. So you see now the connection between termination and the Indian Reorganization Act era, the Indian New Deal, the Collier era. There is a connection, because now if the tribes didn't do what Collier wanted them to do, the federal government was basically coming back and saying, well, you're not legitimate now if you don't have a government. If you don't have a constitution, well, they didn't, not necessarily a constitution, but All right, so other states were allowed to assume jurisdiction if they wished by statute or state constitutional amendment. Several states did without tribal consent, okay? Then states replaced federal authority and diminished tribal authority. Just a note, this tended to run counter to John Marshall's declaration in 1832 that the laws of the state can have no force. Okay. Now, John Marshall, how many schools in the state of Oklahoma are named after John Marshall? John Marshall's words, the laws of a state can have no force, basically sealed it for the state of Oklahoma's case against Creek Nation. See that? Okay. Interestingly, termination does not take away land. Termination only removes the relationship between the federal government and the tribe. Okay? Therefore, and all treaty rights remain untouched. And the treaty rights are not affected. But interestingly, this makes it really, really a pain for some groups. But even if you're an Indian tribe that had been terminated, any property that you own still remains exempt from state taxation, and your hunting and fishing rights by treaty are still there. Now, in Wisconsin, PL 280 state, and in Oregon, and in Minnesota, and Alaska, well, not so much Alaska, but in the PL 280 states then, where tribes didn't even exist, but Native Americans did, as I guess we would say dependent Indian communities, those tribes had treaty rights, and in Washington, we'll see a really good example, Washington State, even though it wasn't PL 280 state initially, Native Americans retained their hunting and fishing treaty rights. And so this poses all sorts of contentious issues between non-natives and natives when it comes to fishing and hunting. In other words, the tribal members if you're an Indian, you're not subject to state regulation of game and fish. You can supposedly, all right? We'll get into this later. Interestingly, political rights take a back seat to environmental regulation. So it's kind of interesting that way. Oh yeah, I'm going to skip that because that's a bad slide. Okay, so the Menominee tribe. This is your case of termination. 1968 case. The Menominee were terminated. They lost their trust relationship, their government-to-government relationship, and but they retained their treaty hunting and fishing rights. And like I said, all terminated tribes remain tribes despite Congress's decision to end their federal recognition. That I've said. So as long as Congress does not expressly pass the jurisdiction that it has over Indian tribes to the states, or as long as Congress does not abrogate treaty rights outright, and it has to do so explicitly, the Congress has to have the words that say, these reservation boundaries no longer exist, okay? Which they never did for the state of Oklahoma. Then they remain with the tribe. So the Menominee, who had a reservation in Wisconsin under an 1854 treaty called the Treaty of Wolf River, the wording in that said, for a home to be held as Indian lands are held. That was another phrase used in the McGirt decision, or at least in the briefs that were filed for it. For a home to be held as Indian lands are held. That would become an incredibly forceful phrase into the future, into the 20th and the 21st century. What does that mean, as Indian lands are held? At the time, well, this led to a judicial interpretation in 1968 in which it was part of the emergence of what is now called the Indian Canons of Construction. And all that means is that the federal government, or at least the federal courts, are obligated to attempt to read the text in the way that it would have been interpreted at the time and in the place. And if there's any ambiguity, the courts have said that you give the tribes the benefit of the doubt. That's a big, big thing. And essentially, the Indian Canons of Construction, I think, were utilized quite a bit by the five who voted in favor of the Creek Nation in the McGirt decision. Indian Canons of Construction we will talk about at length later. So they were terminated in 1961, and then Wisconsin attempted to enforce state game regulations on the lands that within their former treaty boundaries. Okay, and that's all we'll say, except for the tribal members, even the tribes that have. It went to the courts, but anyway. Even if you've been terminated, you retain treaty-based hunting and fishing right privileges and are not subject to state fish and game laws in 1968. The only caveat to that would be that later on, if there was like an endangered species or something, okay, federal law, I hate this word, I used to use it a lot, federal law trumps the Indian Treaty, okay? Supersedes, I guess I have to say now. It supersedes other treaty obligations.